Yeah, no, I think that's a super fascinating area of research. You mentioned just like neuroprotectiveness across beyond just anti-anxiety. I think there's interesting data coming out of ketogenic diets being protective for traumatic brain injury, concussion, etc. I mean, it just sounds like, yeah, ketones uh, are good for the brain in a lot of different ways beyond just anti-anxiety. I mean, I think there's just, yeah, yeah. Yeah, there's just like a bunch of interesting use cases
Yeah,
here.
and I think inflammation may be so. When you get a traumatic brain injury or concussion, the brain is under energetic stress, and there may be, if it's the impact is hard enough, it may cause a dysregulation of various enzymes like pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, PDH kind of activity shuts down, and you get an internalization of like the GLUT3 transporter, which may prevent the brain from being able to use glucose as an energy source.
Right,
And
right.
ketones can bypass PDH and can they have about a third of the steps that's necessary to get into the cell to be used for energy. If you break it
Yep.
down, so they can readily cross membranes via the NCT transporter and be used for fuel, and that's an acute benefit. So if you have a soldier that gets a TBI, it would make sense from my perspective, which may be biased because I'm a ketone researcher, to give that soldier like IV ketones, and it just makes sense.
Yeah.
And then that may attenuate the process of associated with neuroinflammation. So a lot of the downstream consequences of a TBI result in and from neuroinflammation, and part of that neuroinflammation is thought to be due to the NLRP3 inflammasome activation, and it's been
Right.
shown that
Yeah, the Yale
beta-hydroxybutyrate can
research group
suppress
I
that.
think you collaborated with, right? Yeah. Elevated
Yeah,
BHB depresses that. Yep. Yeah, I think it's just like there's starting to be more and more research in this space. And I think
yeah,
I want to just piggyback off what you said with glucose uptake being inhibited potentially by a TBI. I think that's some of the interests around Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, where some schools of thought is that those are metabolic syndromes, glucose uptake issues, and if you're feeding with ketones, you might be able to ameliorate some of those conditions as well.
yeah, absolutely.
What are your
Stephen Cunnane is actually doing some really, what I would say, cutting-edge research on that, where he does a dual PET scan, meaning that he images the metabolism of glucose using fluorodeoxyglucose and also a radio-labeled acetoacetate molecule. On the, and he can simultaneously or kind of in tandem or show the metabolism, the changes in metabolism from glucose and ketones, and how that is impacted with mild cognitive impairment, for example, and in response to different eating paradigms. The general take home from his work is that short-term ketosis can increase brain energy metabolism, and that ketones can essentially help to restore brain energy metabolism when there's a decrease or an impairment in glucose flux or glucose metabolism in the brain. And he's done some elegant work on that, and I think it's really promising the direction that he's going into. And I think we really should probably focus our efforts in understanding how ketone metabolism is impacted in the context of glucose metabolism too, and how
Right.
the body uses both of these fuels, maybe one more preferentially than the other under certain conditions, and that may
Right.
change with development. We know that babies use ketones for fuel, and adolescent, probably a different mix of fuels. And as we age, it appears that our capacity to use glucose decreases with age. But his
But maybe
doctor,
that's because we're just insulin resistant. Maybe
it might
because it's
be,
just a
yep,
bad diet. Yeah. Or it's something else. Yeah. No, it's
insulin
interesting. Yeah.
resistance in the brain. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So that's an area of intense investigation. And I know, I always think of Alzheimer's disease as kind of like brain injury or I think of brain injury really as Alzheimer's disease in real time, right? So after you get an impact in the brain, and the best indicator of someone recovering from traumatic brain injury, the best index of assessing that person would be an FDG PET scan. And that PET scan may actually look very similar to an Alzheimer's patient. It'll be very dim. So there's some correlations in regards to the etiology is obviously different, right? But from a metabolic standpoint, you have kind of a similar metabolic pathophysiology going on with impaired brain energy metabolism, so that it kind of lends itself to this idea of reestablishing normal brain energy metabolism and the ability of your brain to kind of clear out debris and to clear out toxic byproducts of a traumatic brain injury.
Like all the plaque,
energy,
like the tau plaque, right? It's
amyloid
right?
tau.
I think that, right? I think people would say like, oh, is amyloid and tau are those the root cause, or is it because your neurons aren't fueled by glucose properly? They can't clear that out naturally. So it's metabolic dysfunction the core root cause? I think is like the interesting open question.
Yeah, that is the etiology of Alzheimer's is still kind of largely unknown and debated, but it makes sense that if you have impaired brain energy metabolism, you can get the accumulation of these toxic plaques, because breaking down and clearing amyloid is a very energy dependent process. And if there's a decrease in those processes, that can result in the accumulation of these toxic proteins. There's some, I don't know, it's kind of fringe area of research, but there's some indication that perhaps different microbes, whether it be bacteria, maybe even Lyme's disease, causes this persistent neuroinflammation, Epstein-Barr virus, cytomegalovirus. These things may cause like a persistent neuroinflammation, and the amyloid plaque production, amyloid is antimicrobial, and the brain may be producing excess amyloid and maybe not clearing it to as a response to the inflammation. Yeah, and
interesting.
I was when I was first told this, I thought it was really not a very compelling argument. But the more I look into it now, and the more discussion around like Lyme disease and neurodegenerative disorders, there tends to be a growing kind of emerging data to support this idea that perhaps things that cause a chronic inflammatory state, especially a neuroinflammatory state, may be contributing to Alzheimer's disease. And then you have genetic, if you're ApoE4 positive or something, you have some clear genetic influences on that too.
Right. Yeah. No, I think I think that's why biology. So, there's just a ton of open questions. I want to shift gears a little bit towards. We've touched upon. I think we've covered just a lot of why elevating our ketone levels could be beneficial for a lot of indications and to optimize human performance. And I think we touched upon different ways we can do that. And just as a quick overview, right? I think a lot of the reason why our community and myself have been intermittent fasting has been to do that. But as we all know, it's really hard. I don't think it's really hard, but it takes active effort to do fasting or to eat low carb, high fat, or eat a ketogenic diet. And I think that's why there's a lot of excitement and a lot of research around exogenous ketones, which is external ketones, ketone supplements, as opposed to endogenous ketones, what your body naturally produces. So it sounds like the current universe of ketone supplements, three broad buckets. You have, ketogenic fats that are more optimized to turning into ketones to your liver, but there is some sort of conversion process. So things like MCT oil, C8, C10, different carbon length chains of fat. You have ketone salts. As you mentioned, one of the first salts you looked at, sodium beta hydroxybutyrate, and then you have another category, ketone esters. And it sounds like you've been not just looking at at them individually, but also like mixing and trying to generate optimal blends, if you will, for different use cases.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's also just interesting because I think when people talk about ketones, people don't. I mean, there's some subtlety. There's 3 ketone bodies. One isn't used, acetone, which you breathe out, and then there's 2 beta hydroxybutyrate, as we mentioned, and then acetoacetate, which have different properties. Yeah, I'd love to just I think the literature out there is not very clear, not very thoughtful about just actually going through and talking about these as different things. I mean, I think they're all kind of going for the same goal, but I think it just all kind of jumbled together as like, this kind of a mess.
Yeah. I think people are kind of confused too. So it may be good to just kind of do like a little refresher course on kind of exogenous ketones 101, sort of.
Yep, absolutely.
So yeah, and people have described, caprylic triglyceride, which is the C8, the 8-carbon medium chain triglyceride, or capric, which is octanoic acid, or C10, and these have a capacity to generate ketones independent of calorie restriction and independent of carbohydrate restriction. So they are kind of like maybe your first and foremost, maybe like almost like a poor man's ketone ester, right? So you can take caprylic triglyceride and get your ketone levels up maybe about 1 millimolar. I can actually get it up to about like 1.5 on C8 alone. I've been taking it for a while, and I think I've built up sort of a tolerance to it. So if I just take pure C8 oil, I can boost it an extra like 1.
And I think the tolerance is a good point, because we've been playing around with C8 and other exogenous ketones, and if you don't have a tolerance to it, you will blow out your guts. I mean, some of our colleagues here just were out of commission. So it does not necessarily to be taken lightly, where it's just like more is better.
Yeah, there's ways to also increase your your tolerance to C8. So maybe some things I can't necessarily discuss, but there are certain types of fiber, protein, and amino acids that can allow you to, for example, double, maybe even triple your tolerance to caprylic triglycerides. So,
right.
You can leverage various formulations to be able to.
Right. What's a rule of thumb? I think what numbers I've seen, I haven't seen the raw data, is that around 10% of C8 gets converted into, ketones, where the other 90% gets directly metabolized as through fat. I mean, used as like free fatty acids. It feeds your cells directly. Is that about right? Around most of it gets just used as fat, and then in the mitochondria, and then some gets converted to ketones.
Yeah, you know what? That is like highly dependent upon the energetic state of the liver, whether it's depleted in, whether you're in a fasting state, it's depleted in glycogen, or even the subject themselves. Like you can have one person's beta oxidation of fats in the liver may be very, very high, and they rapidly oxidize.
They use it all up directly.
Yeah, and they make a lot of acetyl-CoA, and that can then feed into the reaction to first acetoacetate, and they might be a better metabolizer of MCT. And I think you can build up that metabolism over time. I mean, I remember just like keeling over the first time I tried to consume like 40 milliliters of MCT. I mean, my liver couldn't handle it. It was almost like a bolus to the liver, and I don't know if my pancreas was contracting or my gallbladder contracting or something. So I just had a lot of abdominal pain when that happened. Actually, interestingly, I just taught the GI section to the med students here, and dug a little bit more into the research, and I think MCTs don't really stimulate CCK, cholecystokinin, which would be responsible for contracting the gallbladder. Like long-chain fatty acids do, but MCTs kind of technically don't. It's kind of an interesting. I always assumed they did, but literature that suggests that it doesn't. So they're metabolized very differently than long-chain fatty acids, which are, packaged into chylomicrons, and then they enter the lymphatic system. And kind of they go that route, where when you consume medium-chain triglycerides or even short-chain, they are sent to the liver via hepatic portal circulation, so it becomes like a bolus of fat right to your liver. And your liver may not be ready for that. Right. So, but I believe, the liver is a tremendously plastic organ, and I think it's very rich in mitochondria. When I did mitochondrial isolation studies, like, we would take the liver, and it's just chock full of mitochondria, right? So it has the capacity to kind of upregulate its fat oxidation processes over time. And that's what I believe, and I think we actually want to run some studies to see, to validate that or quantify that, and that'll give us a little bit of insight. So anyway, just kind of getting a little bit off topic, but yeah, the medium MCTs can elevate ketones and be ketogenic independent of carbohydrate restriction. The next, like, exogenous ketone, I guess, like, number 2, I would say number 3 would be the most potent. If you're doing it that way, would be the ketone esters, but like the second most potent would be the ketone salts. For now, it's possible maybe that they can be formulated into a mixture that would be on par with potency with the ketone ester. But really, you're always going to be dealing with kind of a mineral load in the gut, and your gut's capacity to transport these minerals, sodium, potassium, magnesium, and calcium, especially magnesium too, and potassium can be an issue. So a ketone salt would be a ketone salt could actually be sodium free. So, which was I was testing that not too long ago, just versions of ketone salts that had no sodium in it. Yeah. I can tell you that pretty much all. I was
just going to say that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So for the ketone salts, it's instead of having to convert fat into like beta hydroxybutyrate now, you have just the BHB directly binded to a mineral or an anion that delivers into your body. So you're binding something of the raw ketone itself. I didn't want to. I also was curious. I just seen a lot of ketone salts are just beta hydroxybutyrate. Why aren't there acetoacetate salts? That's kind of a side question, but
yeah, there are acetoacetate salts. We make like a sodium acetoacetate salt, but it's not real stable. So we will mix it up fresh and use it for like electrophysiology studies, like then and there. Okay. And the more stable acetoacetate salt would be a lithium salt of acetoacetate, and that's also another salt that we use in our experiments. So the issue with acetoacetate is that it's not as stable as beta hydroxybutyrate, and it can spontaneously decarboxylate to acetone. But interestingly, and that's probably why the predominant ketone in your blood is beta hydroxybutyrate, simply due to it's much more stable, right? But beta hydroxybutyrate needs to be converted to acetoacetate really to be broken down for energy. So it's like the beta hydroxybutyrate is kind of like an intermediate step in the ketone transport and ketone metabolism. It has some unique properties in and of itself, and signaling and stuff too. But the acetone is not really just a waste product, because the acetone can have signaling properties on its own. It can, for example, contribute to the opening of a potassium channel on neurons, and an opening of a potassium channel will cause a hyperpolarization of the resting membrane potential, which can help preserve sort of the bioenergetic effects of the cell and prevent some of the consequences of glutamate-induced hyperexcitability, because glutamate can depolarize the membrane potential, and as it becomes more depolarized, then it becomes more neurotoxic once neurons get to a certain level of depolarization. It can even trigger programmed cell death. So
interesting.
Yeah, and that's actually a pretty big area of the research that we're doing now, is looking at acetoacetate and acetone and subnarcotic levels of acetone, right? Because acetone, we know acetone is something that can take off your nail polish, right? So
Yeah, it's
high
nail
levels.
polish remover. It's nail polish remover.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But low levels, like, subnarcotic levels, if it gets up too high, low levels can have really interesting effects on neuronal signaling. And that's something that I've been kind of getting more into.
Maybe that's why when people are like huffing nail polish remover, they're getting some psychoactive effect there. I mean, interesting. I didn't think about that.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So that's when it comes to anti-seizure effects of exogenous ketones, it's really important to have a exogenous ketone that elevates acetoacetate, just because that has been linked to the anti-seizure effects. And so we're studying various forms of ketone esters that can elevate.
Yeah, I want to drive it back to ketone salts before jumping over the ketone esters.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we got a lot of sidetracked with just like all the things you can bind to beta hydroxybutyrate to make a ketone salt. But I think some of the downsides, as I think you were mentioning, was that oftentimes you don't want that much minerals, whether that's sodium, magnesium, calcium, as sort of like a carrier of beta hydroxybutyrate into the body.
Yeah, sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium, lithium. I mentioned too. You can make a lithium salt of beta hydroxybutyrate, and then the alkaline amino acids too you can make them. Arginine, lysine, citrulline, histine. There's a bunch. There's
glycine. A lot of things are bound. You can bind a lot of things.
Yeah, but the monovalent monovalent cations like sodium and potassium, it'll bind one beta hydroxybutyrate, but the divalent cations like magnesium and potassium and sodium, are monovalent, and they can get one beta hydroxybutyrate, whereas magnesium and calcium can bind two molecules of beta hydroxybutyrate. So that, in theory, that should increase their capacity to elevate beta hydroxybutyrate in the blood. But if you just take them in isolation, there's not, a dose-dependent response in elevation of blood ketones, and that has to do with their probably with their GI intolerability. So that it becomes very important to be able to formulate things and to test them in many different ways to determine what is
you can actually uptake
palatable.
it. Yeah, you just don't overload it. You just pee it out aloud. You actually can take it in.
And sodium is important because pretty much every transporter in the gut, whether it be amino acid transporter or even sodium transporter, it is a transporter with sodium. So the sodium ion gradient is actually what drives the movement of molecules across the brush border membrane there. So having a lot of sodium in the product is actually a pretty good thing for bioavailability, for enhancing absorption. And I'm not of the opinion that sodium is actually something that's dangerous for our health. It can be maybe if you're like a type 2 diabetic or you have some kind of kidney problems, but I can tell you that, it's for kidney problems, it's really the amount of substrate that's in your blood. I mean, to some point, it's the minerals too, but like high blood glucose will kill your kidneys faster than ketones or even minerals.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I think it's like the high salt argument, which, I'm not well versed enough there to really come on either side. But like I guess what you're driving towards is that there's like this school of thought that high sodium, high salt is maybe bad for blood pressure or some of these other things, and I guess there's an alternative school or a separate school where it's like, hey, high sodium levels aren't the root cause here.
Yeah, I would definitely say that. And I think what we know about salt is sodium chloride, and sodium beta hydroxybutyrate is much different than sodium chloride. I mean, I have not been able to, I thought I could maybe get a transient elevation of blood pressure with sodium beta hydroxybutyrate, but that does not happen.
You weren't lifting blood pressure. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, and that does not. So sodium beta hydroxybutyrate does not. So I think with salt, we're talking about table salt. It may be the chloride too, the sodium chloride. But we know from renal physiology, if we deliver sodium chloride with an equal amount of potassium, we can abolish the transient sodium-induced increase in blood pressure with that if we simply offset it. So that was kind of the rationale, with developing the ketone salts too, is that you need to balance the sodium with an equal amount of potassium. And
right.
But if you just
Which
take
is interesting.
sodium,
it's like a buffer. It's essentially like a buffer when you do like product development. You often see like potassium chloride or sorbate in there, and that's like a preservative. It's like a common buffer to balance out the acidity base basic levels. Yeah, so just adding, people talk about alkaline water, so drink alkaline water. Well, if you just drink a glass of tap water and just take, potassium citrate or something, that'll be far more alkaline than, probably any alkaline water you're buying out there. So, potassium and just minerals in general have a pretty remarkable buffering capacity, as do some amino acids too. You have, sodium and potassium, magnesium and calcium. And these things, we do not yet know the ideal ratios for these to be, formulated to optimize the ketone salt intake. And we do know, though, that if you formulate a ketone salt product and then you combine that ketone salt with medium chain triglycerides, you can, get significantly elevated blood ketone levels above and beyond what you could with either one alone. And that becomes a kind of important, the MCTs will delay gastric absorption a little bit, and that I think by delaying gastric absorption, that slows down gastric transit time, and it allows for more of the sodium salts to be absorbed because they're not, going all the way down to the large intestine and colon and being shot out the other side, right? So you have, the fats tend to decrease peristalsis and to some extent, and you have a delayed gastric absorption with that. So we're still like messing around with different types of medium chain fats and, with different types of fiber and even with amino acids to optimize absorption on that. But I think we're getting to the point where you can, reliably get to 2 to 3 millimolar with a sodium or with a ketone salt product that's formulated with ketogenic fats. So they're actually getting to the point where, I've taken ketone esters and wouldn't want to go over 3. When I get above 3 millimolar, I don't feel good. I start to actually maybe even get more anxious. I think 2 may be at the top of the bell-shaped curve. And once you get above that, your body, you're getting a mild acid load that the body has to deal with. And if it's not being used for fuel and you're just, sitting at your desk and you're not, maybe if you were kind of hard charging, with exercise, that might be different because you're utilizing it. But, I think... That's interesting. I think for me personally, I'll get to 2.5 millimole with 3-ish days of fasting. I'll hit 5.5 with 7 days fasted. Yeah. I think getting, I don't know. I mean, I think it's also like, it's a little bit subjective, but it seems like I'm more in flow state when I'm closer to the 5 than the 2.5. But I think there's, yes, your mileage may vary in terms of just how everyone's
I was talking about exogenous. So in the context of fasting, where you have limited, restricted glucose availability, I think maybe those levels may be optimal when you're at like an energy deficit. But I think if you're just eating like a eukcaloric diet that's, just general low carb, like most people are doing, and they want to take a ketone supplement, I think pushing your levels, even above 2 may not even be optimal, because I'm just going upon, the work that we've done here. Like if I artificially push it up, 1 and start to go above 2 into the 3 range, I just start to feel unwell. And it's not the mineral load from the ketone salts too, because I could use the ketone esters, and I can use a number of different esters and kind of feel the same way once I get into that
we talked
range.
about esters quite a bit. Can you help us define in esters? And I think there's multiple classes. Yeah, there's also multiple ketone esters, just like there's multiple ketone salts. And I think that's like another aspect that I think is very unclear in the literature out today.
Yep.
Yeah,
okay.
I think there's. I would say that I think the two most studied ketone esters are the beta hydroxybutyrate monoester, and I think there's also I think and also just emerging literature around acetoacetate diester. Could you help break that down and talk through it?
Yeah, and maybe one of the first esters I was kind of got interested in was a triester of glycerol. So glycerol with 3 beta hydroxybutyrates on it, and that's another thing that we test in the lab. But I would say the ones that are probably of most interest would be 1,3-butanediol beta hydroxybutyrate monoester and 1,3-butanediol acetoacetate diester. So we have experience with both of them for. So I guess 1,3-butanediol is kind of, I would describe it as an alcohol. It's a glycol, it's technically a di-alcohol, and you can do a reaction where you do a transesterification reaction. You can combine acetoacetate to it essentially, and get 2 molecules of acetoacetate on 1,3-butanediol, and that would be a acetoacetate diester. A 1,3-butanediol acetoacetate diester, and when that's consumed, the ketones are liberated with hydrolysis in the gut, and they can enter your circulation very rapidly. So you get a pretty, from a pharmacokinetic curve point of view, a very rapid spike in acetoacetate, which we've found is essential to get the neuroprotective anti-seizure effects that we're looking for. That spike in acetoacetate is necessary.
So like the main difference in between the lines here is that you don't need to carry a cation carrier like a mineral or an amino acid to carry the ketone into the body. You just have immediate precursors, if not the actual ketone itself, being able to be carried into the body directly in a bioavailable form.
Yes. That's right. So with the ketone salts, you have an ionic bond that the ketone would be, your negative, and then the whether it be the mineral or the amino acid has a positive charge. So you have, and then that when you ingest it becomes liberated the mineral, from the beta hydroxybutyrate, and it enters circulation. So with a ketone ester, there is an ester bond there, and there's various esterase enzymes in the gut and in the liver, and even in the muscle too, throughout circulation in your blood even.
So the body knows how to break it down directly into usable parts.
And so we consume a ketone ester, and typically what happens, whether it's a beta hydroxybutyrate ester or an acetoacetate ester, the ketones are rapidly liberated from the 1,3-butanediol, and the 1,3-butanediol is a ketogenic compound in that it gets broken down pretty much completely to beta hydroxybutyrate. So it's kind of convenient in that way. You could conceivably just take 1,3-butanediol, and it's pretty potent ketogenic, nasty-tasting ketogenic agent, but there's a lot of research behind it.
Right, but you'll get drunk first, right? Because it is alcohol, so you get drunk, but then you have super high ketone levels. Is my understanding? So you get the alcohol plus the ketones.
You get a little bit buzzed.
1,3-butanediol.
Yeah, you do get a little bit buzzed, and you could say, well. And maybe combining it, with a ketone molecule may attenuate a little bit of that buzz. But I can just tell you from experience, once you start dosing up the ketone, whether it be acetoacetate or beta-hydroxybutyrate ketones, you start to get a little bit buzz, especially around like the 5 millimolar point. And
Yeah.
I don't know if it's not like in some ways it's a little bit like an alcohol buzz, but it's not the same, I think. And I don't think it's a healthy state. It's a state that I don't like to be in, because I think it's just adding more energy to your system, and your body has to deal with the acidosis, and it can't be a good thing. So that's why I'm kind of the opinion the maximum tolerable dose is no way the optimal dose. And I think the optimal dose may actually be closer along the lines of like the minimum effective dose and slightly above that. So you're keeping your body kind of hungry for the ketones instead of saturating everything with surplus calories of ketones, which I think can, if done continuously over a long period of time, may actually cause some problems. There's some evidence that, with even the racemic form, so that's a whole nother thing that we can kind of talk about.
It's a whole nother can of worms talking about, DNL forms, left-handed, right-handed versions of organic compounds.
Yeah. So with the ketone esters, unless it's a glycerol like triester, beta-hydroxybutyrate, then no, actually I think the glycerol triester is also racemic beta-hydroxybutyrate, the ones that are being kind of in studies right now. So so there's a little bit of discussion as to, is racemic beta-hydroxybutyrate something that you should be concerned about? And I think it's a good question. I don't think the evidence now supports that it's in any way harmful. That it's been used. There's a Lancet paper by Van Hove, I believe, that studied DL beta-hydroxybutyrate salt, sodium beta-hydroxybutyrate, the racemic, for multiple acyl-CoA dehydrogenase deficiency, or MAD. And in that study, if I remember correctly, it had a number of kids in the study. It basically reversed the symptoms of this disorder, and it was given it in massive doses for a lengthy period, like 900 milligrams per kilogram, like every 4 hours. And it essentially prevented cardiomyopathy and completely almost reversed a lot of cerebral dysfunction. So it's also been used, that's actually, there's studies using it in IV administration too. So that's a really high dose, and a number of other.
I agree. I think it's open question. I think some researchers think that the racemic form is really bad for you. I don't think there's data that I've seen that says that. I think you're right. I think it's, they're probably being used in a different way, but it's not necessarily. It seems like people have been using it safely, and it doesn't seem. I think there needs to be some research to be like, okay, how are they potentially being used differently from each other, if they are, and if so, is that better or worse than just the D form, which is what the body naturally produces?
Well, the body, you also have the racemase enzyme that converts the D form to the L form too. So you always have, the body does produce like the L form, and that's being made in small quantities, and the tissue distribution of the racemase will kind of differ in different areas. So as far as the safety, I'm not concerned that there is a safety issue. Just you have these ketone salt products that are on the market, and I know one company has sold millions of doses to, I guess, millions of people, and they're overdosing on this stuff. I know some of them because they're emailing me, and there's no bodies are accumulating from millions of doses being taken, maybe some GI discomfort, and from the blood work that I've seen, people taking large amounts, everything is improving. If you just look at the blood work, if there was any sign of toxicity, something would come up with millions of doses being taken. So one guy did, a couple in particular, like one fellow emailed me and actually thought I was working with the D isomer, and was kind of adamant that there may be some problems even with D, because the racemic form is redox balanced, right? So if you have a pure D enantiomer, it's really shifting the NAD plus NADH couple towards a more reduced state. And many diseases are kind of associated with reductive stress, right? Like type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome. So if you're giving an agent that's shifting the redox state of the cell, the physiology, to a more reduced state, you could get reductive stress theoretically. But with racemic, it's essentially redox balance in that way. So I had it.
Wasn't the argument there is that you actually want to increase the redox span, so you potentially have just more efficient, you carry the electrons through more efficiently, so you just generate less ROS.
In theory, I mean, that's kind of what that was my understanding, I believe.
Yeah.
But there's also a number of there's also evidence for redox stress or reductive stress. So many diseases are associated with the tissue is essentially hypoxic, right? So you're going to have not oxidative stress, you're going to have reductive stress. And that would be diseases of, obesity, type 2 diabetes, and you're kind of artificially elevating something that could be inducing more reductive stress by shifting things, shifting the redox balance to a more reduced state. So someone, it's contacted me and was like sending papers, but I said, no, we actually work with the racemic, which is redox balanced in that way. But I haven't seen any evidence that would be in any way harmful. I know most of the research has been done with the racemic, so there's a pretty good track record with the racemic, but I don't know of any really long-term high-dose chronic feeding studies that have been done with the D enantiomer in maybe disease states that would have redox stress, like type 2 diabetes and things like that. So I don't know, this researcher kind of reached out to me and was like, well, we haven't done enough, studies with the D. We've done pretty long-term studies, 25 grams per kilogram, studies of the racemic salts and the racemic esters for 15 weeks in rats, which is like essentially a couple years in humans. And we did all the clinical chemistry and things like that and saw basically everything was kind of going in a positive direction. So we're working on that and get that published soon. But so there is a little bit of debate, I guess, with the D and also maybe with the racemic. And I think what's really needed is just more studies, and also to do some studies to look at the redox state of the liver and the redox state of the cells. And if there are pathologies that are associated with with reductive stress, to see if the D enantiomer contributes more to the reductive stress.
Interesting. I that's the first time I've heard of that. I mean, it seems like that's an interesting research area because, I think what you mentioned that the body endogenously produces the D, so through fasting, etc. And it sounds like a small percentage may convert into the L. So it seems like if fasting would trigger some of these same things, if just having a super reduced state could be bad, well then doing fasting and low carb high fat diets would be an endogenous way to turn that get into that state, which seems to be right. Like it wouldn't necessarily just be a problem with just D enantiomer or beta hydroxybutyrate. It'd be like all the natural pathways to elevate BHB, which the vast majority of the naturally produced BHB is D form.
Yeah. I think the question is if you artificially kind of elevate the D form for extended periods of time in someone that has overt signs of pathologies that cause reductive stress, what will that do? I mean, it's an interesting question, and I think it should be studied. A lot of things should be studied, right? So we're doing quite a bit of work, and maybe some of the tissues and the blood that we collect, we can go back and kind of look at the potential for that, because my background was actually kind of it's what I teach too, is redox biochemistry. So for me, it's actually a really interesting kind of field to look at, because we know a lot of enzymes, a lot of signaling pathways, and even ion channels.
Going to be one of the most fruitful areas of research in metabolism, right? Like I think people more and more realize that this is one of the core. This is how bodies create energy. This is how this core mechanism affects basically every other process in the body. And if you can, improve it, optimize it, fix it, I mean, you could potentially help or enhance a lot of endpoints that we want to be, solving for.
We need technologies to be able to in real time track, measure acetoacetate beta hydroxybutyrate with something like a Dexcom. And I think this has been of interest to the Department of Defense.
That would be very cool.
Yep.
Yeah, because I wear glucose monitors that are continuous. That's one question I've always asked. Like, why aren't there continuous ketone monitors?
Yeah, well, there should be. I think, and I think as technology advances, you'll probably have things where you put essentially a patch on your skin, and little nanoprobes will be able to detect not just beta hydroxybutyrate, but maybe actually give you a real-time metabolomic
all your
profile
metabolites.
Lactate.
Yeah, all your metabolites. Yeah. Yeah,
Yep.
I think that would be the holy grail for me as a biohacker. Like I track my glucose because there's a medical use case there for type 2 diabetic or just diabetics in general. But yeah, why not be able to track your acetoacetate, beta hydroxybutyrate, glucose? Lactate could be interesting as well, and just learn and optimize and see what zones you want to be targeting. Like that, that seems like it will. That should be that's data that we should have. Like it seems like inevitable that we will have it at some point, but it will take work from engineers, innovators to make that happen.
Yeah, they're contacting me, and I think I'm still waiting to get the prototypes. But I've seen some of the prototypes that they're working on, and it's a little bit big of a device to wear, but these things are in the pipeline, and I think they may allow us to optimize our health and maybe our performance, and maybe. For me, I'm interested because it can protect an astronaut or a Navy SEAL diver from extreme environments if we know the neuroprotective anti-seizure, levels of these.
You confirm they're in the right zone all the time, right? Like, okay, we want to be at least 3.0 millimolar or whatever. Let's stay in that zone. They can dose themselves essentially. This has been an awesome conversation so far. I don't want to run too over time, but I want to give you the last word here. It sounds like deep in, I think what's interesting about your body of research is that you're pretty agnostic in terms of looking at all different types of mechanisms to elevate ketones, where I think a lot of research groups focus on one or two specific compounds. Can you give us a sneak peek of, what's the research look like in the future? What are some of the most fruitful areas that you're most excited about?
Wow, I'm excited about so many different things all at once. So, let me take a step. Some of the more recent data that we got is on neuro regeneration, and looking at the effects of how neurons can enhance neurite outgrowth and things like that, how ketones can affect that process. And that may have implications for, brain injury and various neurodegenerative disorders. So that is, something that's of interest to me. As far things that I'm super excited about is probably we're working with NASA actually to do some research in the way of metabolism, heart rate variability, gut microbiome, some cognitive tests using NIH Toolbox to do some measurements on the NASA NEMO mission, which would be NEMO 22 is coming up, and it's the Earth-based space analog for deep space missions to Mars and things like that. So
seeing if elevated ketone levels through some sort of exogenous ketones could make astronauts more efficient, essentially.
That's of interest, but we actually need to, before testing some of the ketone molecules, we have to find out how living in saturation in this extreme environment first affects microbiome. We know that the CO2 level in that environment is about 10 to 20 times higher, and that can actually impact the gut in a way where it can impact the tight junctions and actually lead to a leaky gut. There's some evidence of that, and there's some evidence that it can kind of cause inflammation. So we want to assess first how that environment, which would be like an astronaut environment or a deep sea environment, how that can impact the gut microbiome and how this can impact cognitive functions. And we're going to assess body composition alterations. So we're working with them to do a pretty comprehensive study, multiple IRBs involved in the study, and collect some data on metabolism, on all these different factors, cognition, body composition, and then that kind of sets the stage for a countermeasure that can be used in the form of maybe not just ketones, but ketones and maybe some other metabolites or cofactors, basically developing a nutritional countermeasure to enhance the safety and performance and long-term kind of health for that individual in that environment. So that's sort of a project that we're working on now that I'm most excited about.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, and I think I've just seen the velocity of how you've been publishing. I mean, it sounds like you are, it's quite productive, and maybe productive because have elevated ketone levels and therefore better cognition all the time.
I think it helps.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think exactly why we're so interested in the space from a startup company perspective as well as a community perspective. I think that's why I think that I think if you look at keto, if you look at exogenous ketones, these are going to be macro trends. I see a lot of interesting innovation in the next few years. I think definitely be something that, like, you look at omega-3s being commonplace as something that's like generally probably good for you. The same thing will happen with exogenous ketones.
I think so too.
Curious to follow along, and I think our community will be curious to follow along to see how this space unfolds in the very, very near futures, because I think a lot of this is happening now.
Yeah, it's happening really fast. In the short time that I've just been on this, when I first got into this research, it was the ketogenic diet for pediatric epilepsy. And now, we had a conference and there's like, a dozen or more applications now that are, being studied in registered clinical trials. So there's a lot of ongoing research, and you'll see all that hitting PubMed. Well, you're starting to see it now, but you'll see a heck of a lot more in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah. Awesome, Dom. Thanks so much. Really a pleasure to talk, and then we should do this again soon.
We'd love to. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, thanks. Another great conversation with another leading ketone researcher. I had a lot of fun talking to Dom. I think we got an interesting perspective from Dr. Brianna Stubbs, which we had on a couple months ago, where she's been out of studying ketones out of an Oxford group. I'm excited to see how the space unfolds. I think we're, as a company, very keen on looking at the latest developments there and potentially helping accelerate bringing some of these technologies to market. So stay tuned there. As always, send us any questions you might have on ketones, biohacking, everything. We love being able to surface up your questions directly to some of the best guests that we have. And as always, we're on Apple iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, and YouTube. Until next time.